Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I learned a new phrase the other day. It was following all protocols. So that way, if I forget to say good afternoon to some group of people, I've said following all protocol, right? So I've covered everyone in the room. I am honored to be presenting this paper on behalf of a wonderful group of co-authors that you see listed there. Two of them are in the room, and I'd like to acknowledge them, Andrea Wirtz and Anita Radix, for their hard work over the last 1.5 to 2 years on this paper. Is somebody go whoop, whoop for them? Yeah, okay. So this paper was actually many papers in one. We did a comprehensive review of risk and vulnerabilities among transgender sex workers. We did a systematic review of prevention interventions. We did mathematical modeling to look at the impact of specific interventions in this population. And we did case studies to contextualize the data. And importantly, we included 3 community voices of transgender sex workers talking about their own experiences. So I'm going to try to summarize all that in about 10 minutes. To start off with, I want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the terminology that we use for the paper. For the purposes of this project, transgender was defined as a diverse population of people whose gender identity or expression differs from their natal sex. That means their sex assigned at birth on their birth certificate. When we talk about transgender women, we're talking about people who are male assigned at birth, but who live their lives along a feminine spectrum, and vice versa for transgender men. Unfortunately, when we did our review, we found a dearth of data on transgender men, sex work, and HIV, so we weren't able to include them in this review. So I'll sometimes abbreviate and say trans sex worker. If you could just expand that in your mind to mean transgender women sex workers, that would be very helpful to me. All right. When we started the project, one of the questions was how many transgender women engage in sex work? And unfortunately, there's very little data to inform that. The data that does exist is not based on a representative sample, and actually we only found a couple of studies. Most are based in the United States, and this one particular meta-analysis gave a range of 24 to 75%. And another study that was published out of the Asia-Pacific region, specifically in Malaysia and India, found that up to 80% of transgender women engage in sex work. We also didn't find a lot of data in terms of the HIV epidemiology. What's been published most recently has found that transgender women sex workers face a disproportionate risk of HIV. So you'll see from the graph here that in this meta-analysis, transgender women sex workers face 4 times the risk of HIV compared to non-transgender female sex workers. So don't worry, I'm not going to take you through every word on this slide. I know it could be scary, but what it does is summarize the multi-level social ecological framework that we developed based on a comprehensive review of the literature. So when we did the review looking at HIV vulnerability and risk among transgender sex workers, we were able to come up with this framework to pull it all together. And I'm going to walk you through just a couple of examples. So you'll see at the top are, along the columns, 4 levels of vulnerability ranging from structural to biological. And on the left-hand side, you'll see 3 domains, including health services, socioeconomics, and legal and cultural context. In the first example, you'll see how the horizontal path illustrates how criminalization of sex work increases the risk of sexual violence, which reduces the likelihood of using condoms. And you can see that there are multiple pathways by which it does that, either directly or through increased risk of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, as well as through increased risk of substance abuse. If you follow the path that goes vertically, you'll see how discrimination leads to reduced job opportunities and therefore less access to health care due to either lack of insurance or lack of funds to pay for care. As I mentioned, the series included 3 voices of transgender women sex workers and their lived experiences. And it helps to demonstrate how many transgender sex workers have faced the layered vulnerabilities with both resilience and hope. And I have here a statement, an excerpt from the community voice from Joya Sidker, who I think might be in the audience today, and if so, she can wave. She's the president of the National Platform of Sex Workers in Bangladesh. And she talks about her process of finding resilience and hope, and I'll give you a few seconds just to read what she wrote. So given the high burden of HIV among trans sex workers and the multiple axes of vulnerability that they face, effective interventions are critical. Our systematic review of the literature found very few interventions that were tailored for transgender women and no interventions that exclusively focused on trans sex workers. What we did find were 6 interventions that had outcome measures that were published in the peer-reviewed literature. We found 5 ongoing clinical trials, and only 1 of them was outside of the United States. And we found 2 interventions that were not in the published literature, but that had been presented at the international AIDS conferences. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details of these studies, but they are available in the paper. To summarize, the current evidence does suggest that the best interventions are those that are multi-level, addressing structural barriers as well as behavior change, and as well as being community-led and grounded in empowerment. As other authors have mentioned, we have promising new biomedical interventions, and those interventions may also hold promise for transgender sex workers. Unfortunately, we don't have much data in transgender sex workers. The seminal study, IPREX, for pre-exposure prophylaxis did include transgender women, but without an adequate sample size to do a separate analysis. So what we need in the future, as people move forward with studies on these promising interventions, is to not only include transgender sex workers, but also to include them with an adequate sample size to be able to do a trans-specific analysis. We also need studies for transgender sex workers who've had genital reconstruction surgery, need studies that assess the risk of HIV in the neovagina. Using the data that we have on the efficacy of specific interventions, we use mathematical modeling to investigate whether it would be possible to decrease the number of new infections by 50% over a 10-year period. This slide is illustrative and doesn't include real data. That will come in the next slide. But it looks at how each intervention impacts new infections. So if you start with the baseline and our goal of a 50% reduction, you'll see the 5 interventions that we looked at. Those include increased condom use with stable partners, and we looked at an increase of about 20%, increased condom use with clients of about 20% uptake of pre-exposure prophylaxis, early access to antiretroviral therapy within 1 or 2 years of infection, and a reduction in the number of transactions of about 20% based on higher income for the same number of in transactions. So hopefully that's clear. While we were only able to model proximal determinants, so you'll see here behavior change and biomedical interventions, our interpretation was based on our conceptual framework that showed that upstream changes are required in order to affect these changes in behavior and in access. We modeled 2 distinct epidemiological settings using data from Lima, Peru, and San Francisco in the United States. These settings differ sometimes dramatically in terms of geography, income level, HIV care coverage, and also what's known about sexual positioning among trans sex workers. You see the results here. The red line represents a 50% reduction in new infections over the course of 10 years. In Lima, I won't go through all of it in detail, but we did look at each intervention both in isolation and in combination for each setting. And to summarize, in Lima, we found that an increase in condom use was essential to achieve the goal. And a 50% reduction was reached only when combining increase in condom use with clients with other interventions. In San Francisco, you'll see the red bar is a little further to the right. It takes more interventions to receive a 50% reduction because the standard of care is already high. Importantly, you need to note that these interventions had to be sustained over the entire 10-year period in order to demonstrate impact. So the model makes it clear that interventions require different combinations and had a different impact depending on the setting. Therefore, tailoring prevention programs to social and epidemiologic context is essential. In order to explore relevant context, we use both peer-reviewed literature and published reports from the community to develop detailed case studies for 6 countries that represent diverse geographic, epidemiologic, and social-legal context. Those include the ones highlighted here: India, Kyrgyzstan, Peru, South Africa, Thailand, and the United States. In doing these case studies, we found that research on trans sex workers was of variable quality, and I use variable quality in the same way that Stefan used variable quality, or absent altogether. In this map, you can see that 2 of the countries are outlined in brown but are gray in the center, and those are countries that had no HIV prevalence data for trans sex workers: South Africa and Kyrgyzstan. And in fact, no countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia had any HIV prevalence data for transgender sex workers or transgender women. Where data did exist, transgender sex worker data was frequently hidden within studies of MSM or female sex workers. We also found that laws, policies, and social norms impact the HIV experience among transgender sex workers. In particular, contradictory laws and HIV policies challenge the provision and access to HIV services. This map illustrates some of that complexity. Of the case study countries, the countries in pink, basically the United States, have some laws against discrimination. And you'll note here that that's variable across the country, depending on locality. Countries in gray have no supportive policies. Those include Peru, Kyrgyzstan, and Thailand. And countries in dark brown legally recognize gender change or transgender identities. Those include India and South Africa. However, the supportive policies that are available are complicated for trans sex workers because in many cases, where supportive laws may exist around gender identity and expression, there is also criminalization of sex work. And these include the countries that are circled here. Also, what these maps don't depict are the structural factors beyond laws and policies that impact trans sex workers, particularly stigma. For example, Kyrgyzstan doesn't have any supportive or harmful laws, yet there is significant stigma against transgender women in that country that impacts their risk and vulnerability to HIV. There are several implications to the findings of the modeling and the case study scenarios taken together. The first is that combination prevention is essential, similar to what we've seen in the other papers, and it has to be sustained in order to have real impact on HIV. The context, including epidemiologic, social, and legal, must be taken into consideration when developing interventions. Changing proximal factors like condom use requires addressing upstream factors like violence and discrimination. Overall, more research is needed, basic research such as HIV prevalence, as well as intervention research. When we were looking to do the modeling study, we were only able to find 2 cities that had enough data to be able to do this model. So research is needed in other settings with significant trans populations in order to use that data to prioritize interventions. And in conclusion, transgender sex workers bear a disproportionate burden of HIV due to a unique combination of biologic, individual, interpersonal, and structural vulnerabilities. Researchers must collect trans-specific data that clearly separates trans women sex workers from male and non-trans female sex workers. And there's an urgent need for evidence-based interventions that are acceptable for trans women sex workers, appropriate for the local context and culture, and target the key drivers of HIV risk in this population. I'd like to acknowledge Joya, Golem, and Rose, who were the 3 trans sex workers who contributed their voices, as well as all the transgender sex workers who participated in the research that provided the data for this review. Also gratitude for those who helped with the modeling, as well as to our funders. Thank you.